Another Friday off the Florida coast, and thousands of travelers are embarking on a dream, a voyage at sea, a cruise, a taste of the good life.
Just being far away from everything. And the people here just cater to you left and right. It's fantastic.
It is the ultimate escape fantasy. Perhaps at one time men ran away from home to escape at sea. And I think we still do that. I think we run away from our everyday lives to board that ship, and the moment you board, everything that you left behind is behind.
The vacationers sailing toward Bermuda or the Bahamas are only the latest in a long line of ocean-going travelers. But the ships are another story. They are modern echoes of a glorious past, the descendants of royalty. Their ancestors were the queens of the sea, Elizabeth and Mary, and the great steel titans with names like Rex and Europa and Lusitania, and of course, Titanic. Once they ruled the waves, and their stories created legends. There was greatness in them, and ambition, and almost unbearable tragedy. They would come to symbolize a different age, an age when steel and steam gave birth to industry and power, when nations fought for supremacy, and when a man with enough money could build a dream and make it float. It all began with one man's simple dream to build a ship to carry mail and possibly some passengers between the old world and the new. The man was the British-Canadian Samuel Cunard, his ship the Britannia.
When Samuel Cunard regularized a steam service in 1840, about 2 weeks, and that was a very good crossing time.
Powered by steam but carrying sails in case of engine failure, Britannia shattered every record for a transatlantic crossing. For her efforts, she won a prize that later became the most coveted of its kind in the world, the Blue Riband, a mythical pennant awarded to the fastest ship to cross. The prize was intangible, but its value was real, measured in pride and bragging rights. With it, Cunard was firmly set to become the most famous name in transatlantic travel. For the company, it was smooth sailing. For its passengers, it was something else.
Pretty horrendous conditions on board. Really one public room, tiny cabins, a lot of noise, a lot of damp, a lot of seasick.
One famous passenger on the Britannia was Charles Dickens, embarking on a barnstorming tour of America. If he had any great expectations for the trip, they were soon dashed.
It was on that crossing that Dickens penned those immortal 6 words for anybody who's ever been affected by seasickness, which is not ill, but going to be. And that's the way you felt. You felt this constant illness. Perhaps you didn't throw up, but you felt you were going to die.
He was so unhappy that he went back by sailing ship. He said, I've had enough of that damn Cunard ship. I don't want to go near her again.
Dickens notwithstanding, steamships were soon the way to cross. Cunard led the field, with its ships consistently winning the Blue Riband. And holding that symbolic award became a matter of national pride for the British. But a newly unified Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was prepared to fight back. It built 2 great ships, and in 1897, one of them, Kaiser Wilhelm the Gross, won the prize.
The British response was to, we've got to build bigger ships, but it would, of course, take a little time to do that. You just couldn't do that overnight or a year later. So they began to produce bigger ships, but the speed thing had to wait another 10 years until about 1907.
To achieve greater speed as well as size, the British seized on a new technology, the marine steam turbine. Up till then, ships relied on a reciprocating engine, in which steam pushed a piston connected to a crankshaft which could turn a propeller. With a turbine, a jet of steam was directed against turbine blades. The resulting circular movement would turn the propellers in a simple rotary fashion without the need of a connecting crank. The result was greater speed for less money. This breakthrough was the brainchild of an unexpected kind of engineer, the Honourable Charles Parsons.
He was the fourth son of an earl, so this is a very, very unusual background indeed. He became what was termed a gentleman or premium apprentice. He certainly was driven. There are many accounts from his fellow workers and people who worked under him as to simply how irascible he could be.
Using turbines, Parsons created a small boat 100 feet long and just 9 feet across that he named Turbinia. The power of 3 engines was harnessed to drive not 1, but 3 propellers each.
So there were 9 propellers driving this little pencil-slim craft. Very wet, very rough, very noisy.
And very speedy. Parsons wanted to show the world just how speedy his experimental craft was.
So he took it down from Northumberland, where it was built, all the way around to Spithead, where there's a great naval review celebrating Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee.
He was refused permission to be in the parade or even to have an anchorage.
And he secreted the Turbinia behind the French warship. And just as the royal yacht, the Victoria and Albert, began its march through the fleet, all the fleets of the world were drawn up in an alley. The Victoria and Albert started down this line.
Parsons, on board the Turbinia, sneaked in, went into the main part of the line, and stepped on the gas.
Parsons pushed the throttle and jostled past the royal yacht, unheard of audacity, and raced through the fleet at the extraordinary speed of 34 land miles an hour.
And outdid everything that they had. The British couldn't possibly catch him. After that, the turbine was made, and the old reciprocating engine was on the way out.
The navies of the world lined up to buy Parsons' new engine, and so did the commercial lines. Cunard believed the turbine held the key to winning back the Blue Riband. More than that, the company believed the engine could win more transatlantic business. With that, Britain could once more rule the waves.
So it becomes a national rivalry. The liners, which were the fastest moving objects, the technological wonders of their time, they symbolized the might of a nation, especially abroad.
That might was about to be tested again by American tycoon J.P. Morgan, a man Teddy Roosevelt had dubbed the last great pirate. Morgan had monopolized his country's railroads, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to own all the ships that would bring passengers to his trains. He already controlled some British shipping.
This raised the spectre, given Morgan's railway connections in the United States, of a Morgan North Atlantic line being able to offer transport all over the continental United States at discounted rates.
So faced with being undercut by Morgan, or even taken over by him, Cunard turned to the British government for help. They wanted its support to build 2 new ships with turbine engines, Lusitania and Mauretania.
The government response to that was to guarantee a $2.4 million loan over 20 years for the building of the Lusitania and the Mauretania, with 2 conditions. Both of these could be run as cruisers, armed merchant cruisers, and secondly, that no foreigner could buy in to the Cunard Company.
Built at a Tyneside shipyard, Mauretania had 7 decks, 15 watertight bulkheads, and a double-bottomed hull. The turbines had grown so immense since Parsons' prototype, company executives and guests posed for pictures in front of them.
The sheer scale, the enormity of these engines was a very, very striking public image.
In a clever stunt, the ship's funnels were laid on their sides and 2 lines of cars were driven through them. In a time when size and supremacy were everything, This picture seemed to say it all. And if that didn't do it, well, Parsons, the master of the publicity stunt, had one more idea.
Parsons brought Tabini alongside Mauritania. They just posed one in front of the other to show this extraordinary application of this little experimental craft to this huge ocean liner behind it.
The finished ocean liner was a wonder to behold, but not to travel on. Passengers soon discovered Mauritania's speed came at the price of comfort.
The seas are more difficult for her, and that she went very fast for that day. She sped across the ocean, which is what everybody liked. And my mother, I remember, felt she was an uncomfortable ship, and everybody went on her because she was fast.
When you build a ship for the North Atlantic, you either build for deluxe or dispatch. You seldom build for both. The Mauritania and Lusitania were a rough ride, and they didn't have things like gymnasium, they didn't have swimming pools.
But what they did have, speed, was fundamental to their owners.
The vessels were revolutionary in the sense that they applied the turbine technology of Parsons. They reached very high speeds of 25 and 26 knots. The Mauritania won the Blue Ribbon back for Britain and held it indeed for 20 years.
So, employing Parsons' designs, Cunard began its 20th century domination of the Atlantic shipping lanes. But J.P. Morgan was not giving up. He turned for help to the operators of White Star, the British company he already owned. These men, Thomas Ismay and his son Bruce, could be as ruthless and ambitious as Morgan.
J.P. Morgan, of course, is the ultimate financier of the whole thing, and you had the Ismays who controlled the White Star Line, and they were fiercely competitive and resentful of Cunard Line and wanted bigger ships.
Morgan and the Ismays wanted bigger ships, in part to woo the rich. The wealthy had become frequent transatlantic travelers, Vanderbilts and Astors and royalty, steaming from continent to continent. Luxury was what they expected. So White Star's plan was to get the greatest palaces imagined on land to float at sea. The result would be almost mythic in size and scope. The Greeks had a name for their giants, and the White Star owners seized on that name to describe the greatest of these ships. After all, they reasoned, what person of power could possibly resist crossing the ocean on a ship named Titanic? On any modern-day cruise, passengers routinely line up for a lifeboat drill before the ship leaves port. And for a few quiet moments, they come face to face with a reminder of ocean travel's most haunting tragedy. The lifeboats that might save today's travelers could not save the passengers of the Titanic. In fact, it is because of that disaster that these drills are now part of shipboard life.
The people talking and instructing were very serious, and they let you know that, as they walked by. They gave you the look and let you know that this isn't a game, this is serious stuff.
I took it seriously because I cannot swim at all.
To perform this drill is to come close to touching the ghosts of Titanic. This is their legacy and their warning. It all began in 1907, during a dinner party at this elegant London house. Bruce Ismay, head of the White Star Line, had gone to dine with Lord Pirrie, head of the shipbuilding yard Harland and Wolff. The two men had the same ambition, to dominate the ocean liner industry, an industry that was all but synonymous with one brand name, Cunard. Over brandy and cigars, the men hatched a plan to rival Cunard, a plan that would leave an indelible mark on history. They would use the money of their principal backer, American tycoon J.P. Morgan, to build a new class of ships unlike any the oceans had seen. Cunard's Mauritania was then the fastest ship, but White Star would create something altogether different.
They said, we're going to give up on speed, we're going to concentrate on luxury. So you have an alternate between the Cunard going for the record, and White Star Line going for a slower passage but in much greater comfort.
To do that, they would create 3 monumental ships: the Olympic, Titanic, Gigantic.
They were able to make top speed of about 22.5 knots. But they were not designed to compete with the Lusitania and the Mauritania as far as speed was concerned.
Olympic and Titanic were built almost simultaneously at the Holland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. The workforce numbered nearly 4,000. The massive scaffolding and crane required, called the Great Gantry, was the largest structure of its kind ever built. 3 million rivets were used to plate each ship's hull with the finest steel of its day. Their builders couldn't know, but it wasn't to be fine enough. Each ship had 8 steel decks and 16 watertight compartments. The ships were designed to remain afloat when any 2 of these compartments were flooded. While the builders never made any rash claims, the press of the day created a new description for this kind of ship.
In a magazine called The Shipbuilder, which is the Bible of the shipping industry, they were talking about the watertight compartments in the ship, and they said in the conclusion of one sentence, if these are all used, it will render the ship practically unsinkable. Well, that word unsinkable survived.
Even if the Titanic did sink, passengers were still supposed to be saved by the lifeboats. But here the builders cut corners. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, originally proposed 64 lifeboats.
My great-uncle in particular did advise the White Star Line that they should have more lifeboats. But the White Star Line said no, it would interfere with the promenade deck, and the first-class passengers wouldn't be able to walk around the deck as easily.
White Star directors and owners found lifeboats to be an inconsequential, ungainly aspect of a ship, and in the diagrams crossed them out and went down to bare minimum.
In the end, for the 2,200 people aboard Titanic, passengers and crew, there were 16 wooden lifeboats, just the minimum required by law, plus 4 only marginally useful collapsible boats. One of the craftsmen working on Titanic was carpenter Tom Parkinson.
Here I have a few of the tools that my father used in the building of the great Titanic.
Andrew was 6 years old when his father took him to see Titanic being launched in May 1911 to begin her fitting out in Belfast Lough.
It was being tugged up along the Belfast Lough by 12 tugboats, and then had generated its own steam, and the propellers all started to work. You could hear the swish of the water, and then the Titanic sailed away under its own steam. And in my boyish innocence, I said to him, "But Dad, how could that big ship stay up in the water?" "Oh," he said, "son, that ship will always stay up in the water." How wrong he was.
As Titanic sailed off for her sea trials, designer Andrews continued to add finishing touches, getting reactions from the crew. He always listened.
Talking to the crew, certainly at that particular period of time, would have been almost unheard of. This was simply a workforce. They could really not have anything of practical value to say to a ship's designer, but Andrews seems to believe that he could learn valuable lessons from the people who had to actually operate the vessel.
Those operating the vessel were happy to help, including one of the stewardesses, Violet Jessup. She and the other staff were surprised that the designer used their ideas.
I think they were overwhelmed that they were asked as crew members to put some suggestions forward, and my aunt, being the tidy soul she was, she liked the idea, you know, her suggestion of creating a little privacy in the cabin, and those tiny little things. He was such a considerate man, and they were all very, very impressed with him.
But for Andrews, the customers needed to be impressed most. The ship's greatest selling point was luxury, and there was much to sell. Titanic was a feast for the eye, a tribute to extravagant wealth and extravagant taste. There was exquisite carving on the first-class grand stairway. It extended over 60 feet from the lower landing to the glass skylight and was impressively styled in 18th century fashion with a Louis XIV balustrade. First-class passengers had their own lounge, a reading and writing room, a smoking room, a gymnasium, a squash racket court, Turkish bath, and a saltwater swimming pool. Still, most of the Titanic travelers were hardly wealthy. There were 1,300 passengers on the maiden voyage, just over 300 of them traveled first class. But the finest materials and the rarest carvings were no match for the primitive forces of water and ice. On the night of April 12, 1912, the unsinkable met the unthinkable when Titanic collided with an iceberg. Stewardess Violet Jessup kept a journal, which her nieces eventually published.
Crash, then a low, rending, crunching, ripping sound as Titanic shivered a trifle and the sound of her engine gently ceased. Quiet, dead silence for a minute. Then doors opened and voices could be heard in gentle inquiry.
6 of Titanic's 16 supposedly watertight bulkheads were open to the sea. The ship was doomed. But few realized it or could begin to imagine what was about to unfold.
Suddenly there was a movement. Men were returning to duty they had but recently left. I realized that I too must hasten on duty.
She had gone up and gotten into the lifeboat after looking after her passengers, making sure they were all right.
Because some of the women passengers didn't speak English, in order to encourage them to get on into a lifeboat, my aunt was told, now you get in and the others will follow, you know.
An officer handed her a baby that a woman, steerage passenger, had left on the deck next to the lifeboat and disappeared. So she held this child all night long, worried that the cork blocks of her life jacket would keep it awake. And when she came alongside Carpathia, they lifted her up in the bosun's chair, still holding this child. And when she got to the deck, out of the crowd, the child's mother re-emerged. She'd reached the Carpathia on another lifeboat, took the child back, and never once in the 3 days before Carpathia reached New York did she attempt to thank the stewardess who'd saved her child's life.
And I remember as a child, she never told us anything about the traumatic, terrible side of things she saw, but she was capable of getting through something ghastly like that without breaking, you know.
The awful arithmetic of that terrible night. 700 people saved, 1,500 killed.
The whole thing is just a string of errors and calamities and miscalculations and the most incredible irony of all. Here's Britain, dominant nation of the world, we can safely say, in so many ways at that time in 1912. This is their wonder ship, their next best technological symbol, and it sinks on its maiden voyage.
After the Titanic tragedy, the third Olympic-class ship, Gigantic, was altered. She was given an entire double skin for her hull, and like all new ships from then on, she had many more lifeboats installed. She was also given a more modest name, Britannic. During World War I, she was turned into a hospital ship, serving in the dangerous seas of Europe. Working aboard, this time as a nurse, was the Titanic stewardess Violet Jessup.
One would have thought, A, she wouldn't have wanted to go back, and B, her shipmates wouldn't have wanted her on board as a kind of Jonah. You know, this was, but she saw it just as her job.
You know, a bit like getting, you have an accident, you get back on a bike or on a horse or whatever it is. She knew there was no way out of her earning her living, so after the Titanic, she knew she had to go back to sea.
In the Aegean Sea in 1916, Britannic hit a German mine, and only 4 years after the Titanic, history was about to repeat itself.
Suddenly there was a dull, deafening roar. Britannic gave a shiver, a long drawn-out shudder from stem to stern.
She went to the bottom in 25 minutes. Violet nearly killed because the bow of the Britannic was down and the lifeboats were going down the side, and the propellers were coming out of the water. So the lifeboats were being drawn into the propellers and chewed up. She was in the lifeboat, and she suddenly noticed that everybody was jumping out.
I turned around to see the reason for this exodus, and to my horror saw Britannic's huge propellers churning and mincing up everything near them.
So she jumped overboard and sank. She was a bad swimmer, couldn't swim at all like most seamen. This is an ironic thing, most sailors can't swim. And she went down, she thought, to the bottom, and then she came up and struck her head on the bottom of the lifeboat, sank again, and then reached out, flailing in the water, and grabbed a hand. And the hand, she squeezed it, and the hand squeezed back, and she knew that was somebody alive, so they held hands and went to the surface together. And she came up to see the water filled with dreadfully wounded men all around her.
Most of the 1,100 on board the Britannic were saved, including Violet Jessop. Only 28 died, a fraction compared to the devastating losses of her sister ship Titanic. To this day, it is that disaster, among all others, that sears through history to break the heart. Titanic came to symbolize what man could achieve and what he could lose. The greatest aspirations of the day ended up destroyed by expediency and pride and nature. When transatlantic crossings resumed after World War I, everything would be different. Today's cruisers are all one class. There are no separate dining rooms, lounges, or pools. The same sun shines on the wealthy and the not so wealthy. But the story was very different for the sea travelers of the early 20th century. Then there were just the upper classes and steerage. But it was the lower class that was actually more important to the owners.
Even though everything we see focuses on the glamour of the, promenade decks of the big lounges and the beauty of these ships for the first-class passengers, that's not where they were making their money. The real bread and butter for so many of these shipping companies was in steerage class.
Hundreds of thousands of Europeans made this voyage traveling as steerage passengers. But the supply of immigrants didn't last. In the 1920s, there was a new fear on the horizon: communism. The US Congress, worried that the human cargo in steerage carried this political virus, acted to cut back immigration. For the passenger lines, that spelled disaster.
Shipping industries had to kind of rethink their strategy. It was really a matter of survival. They couldn't get along on their own with just bringing first-class passengers back and forth.
And so a new kind of travel was born for a new kind of traveler.
You see this new class emerging, bourgeoisie, the middle class. And by the period that we're talking about, the 20s and the 30s, they're feeling comfortable enough that they could at least scrape up $80 or $90. That was what the round-trip transatlantic passage would cost.
So many Americans sailed abroad. It was an immensely successful marketing coup to keep the ships filled, but with a whole change of the thrust of traffic going from westbound to eastbound.
But changes had to be made. The miserable areas below deck were turned into what was labeled tourist third cabin.
Steerage was fluffed up, painted, cleaned, whatever, given beds rather than bunks.
I frankly loved it. I didn't have any objection at all to being in third class because I knew how to get up in first class. And whenever I wanted to, I zipped around here and there, and I was in first class. I had a wonderful time. I didn't mind third class one iota.
Frank Brainard was one of thousands of ordinary Americans who began to make regular crossings purely for the joy of it. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, waves of them traveled the Atlantic every season. Business was thriving, and so once more were national rivalries. The Germans, badly beaten in the First World War, felt strong enough by 1929 to produce 2 liners to rival any in the dominant British fleet, the Bremen and the Europa. They were fast. Within months, Germany had won back the blue riband. But speed, it seems, wasn't everything. If passengers felt queasy on board German ships of the time, it wasn't necessarily because of the rough seas.
I remember the story about Marlene Dietrich sailing on the Bremen in 1933, and her daughter had gone to the gift shop, and there was a huge table set out with books, and the book was called Mein Kampf. And she brought it and showed it to Marlene Dietrich, her mother, and Marlene said, "This is the last time, darling, we'll sail on a German ship."
It would not be hard to find another ship from another country. Every maritime nation was competing for passengers, often recklessly. In Italy, Mussolini was desperate to make his ships advertisements for fascist efficiency. But with one of them, the Rex, he may have gone too far.
He said the Rex is going to sail. The Rex is going to sail on time, just like my trains, and you know, you just have to push it. And they pushed it, and there was a near catastrophe.
Unfortunately, it broke down at Gibraltar, and most of the first-class passengers defected. Sad publicity at the time. She eventually gets to New York, breaks down again. She's got to wait for the next ship to bring in parts from the Italian shipbuilders.
Eventually, Rex overcame her problems and went on to win the Blue Riband in 1933. The only time Italy claimed the prize. Not to be outdone, the French responded by creating something that came to define the modern age of ocean travel. A ship many still consider the greatest ever built, the Normandie.
When the Normandie came out, she was spectacular. That's the word for it.
She was designed to a fare-thee-well.
What the Chrysler building is to skyscrapers, the Normandie was to ocean liners. Just magnificence.
You had this wonderful sweep of completely free from anything else. And the stacks, tall, less tall, less tall, descending in height. Everything about the Normandie was advanced, was different, was fresh, was wonderful.
The wonders increased with the ship's interiors, the epitome of French style and elegance.
Truly Art Deco to the hilt, the most glamorous. The window garden, for example, with caged birds and fountains of water. Bronze doors at the main restaurant, done in Lalique bronze and hammered glass. Sat 1,000 people at 400 tables. Towers of light, just made of Lalique fixtures, just magnificent.
The French cuisine deserved a truly French setting. That restaurant did not disappoint.
It was even longer than the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and it had probably just as much glass as the Hall of Mirrors.
Curiously, this pride of the French fleet was not created by a Frenchman, but by a Russian refugee, Vladimir Yurkovich, who had designed ships for the Tsar before World War I. After he came to France, he won a competition to design the Normandie. His ship took the notion of a floating palace, home to aristocracy, and made it modern. Normandie boasted the high sea's first movie theatre, and stars sparkled not just on the screen, but also on deck. On any crossing, passengers might include celebrities like Josephine Baker, the Rockettes, Cary Grant, the Kennedy family, Marlene Dietrich, and Jimmy Durante, who even dared to poke fun at the French food.
Did you have a good trip coming over, Jimmy?
Why, it was colossal. What a trip. And the food? Why, I had 2 helpings of every course. One going down and one coming up.
But it seemed the real star was always the ship herself. With her maiden voyage to New York, Normandie won the Blue Riband and was greeted as a conquering heroine.
She reaches New York in 4 days, 11 hours and 42 minutes, having averaged 29.68 knots, smashing all previous records. See the fireboats make their fountains of welcome, while every siren and hooter in the river shrieks a greeting to the triumphant stranger.
Britain wasted no time responding. In Scotland's John Brown's shipyard, builders found what they needed, a large hulking mass left unfinished because of the Depression. In 1936, the mass became a ship, the Queen Mary. With government support, the old competitors, Cunard and White Star, combined their forces, and together they operated this Queen and later the Queen Elizabeth. France, a nation of monarchs, would have to compete with a new generation of royalty.
It is hoped the Queen Mary will show a speed of 35 knots, 3 knots faster than the Normandie.
Light and resilient steel helped the Queen Mary win back the transatlantic record from Normandy in 1936, averaging slightly more than 30 knots. It helped too that the Queen had 40,000 more horsepower than the French ship. The two would rival each other in glamour and cachet until the Second World War. They also, of course, battled for the Blue Riband.
Every once in a while, they would exchange records. They'd break one ship's record, and the other would come back and 6 months later and break the record. It was a marvelous period of tremendous excitement for everybody.
As Queen Mary and then her younger sister Elizabeth tried to outdo Normandie's star power, they drew celebrities aboard, and of course, the press.
The newspaper and the media would rush down there and climb. Some of them had to be quite agile to climb up the side of the ship on rope ladders in order to take pictures of the so-called people of note that were going to come back and forth.
Despite the media's close attention, Cunard made sure that their ships kept their dignity. They were, after all, royalty.
The two queens, in particular, in those days were extremely luxurious, beautiful burled woods.
Queen Mary made much of the Cunard and made much of the fact that they were using the finest mahogany and the finest other woods and inlays and everything else.
She was conservative in comparison. Her interiors were very beautiful, modern, but conservative modern.
At a time of dictators and dust bowls, these ships, whatever their country of origin, appeared on the horizon like glittering dreams come to life. Imagination and industry had created beauties of steel and steam, able to conquer any storm, to fulfill any fantasy. Hollywood gave the world Fred and Ginger, but Europe gave us Mary and Elizabeth and Normandie. Ocean travel had been touched with magic.
They left New York at midnight, which is a very romantic way to sail. You board the ship after a nice dinner party with somebody, and you and your friends rattle down to the pier and get on board, and you have this wonderful passage down the Hudson with all the lights lit, and then you wake up the next morning and you're at sea.
Midnight sailings were great. Of course, I had to get on and get in my cabin because I was still a child and go to sleep, but you could look out the porthole and see everybody arriving in evening clothes, and on these foreign ships, the champagne and stuff was served.
And for whatever length the crossing was, 5 days, 8 days, 10 days, you were pampered. You felt like somebody had taken you in the palm of the hand and were just, very carefully transporting you from one continent to another.
But it could not last. This kind of travel was swept away by another world war. Many of the great ships were drafted for use as troop carriers. The Normandie, however, never got that chance. After Hitler invaded France, Normandie was held in New York Harbor, where the US Navy drew up plans to use her as a troop transport, but in February of 1942, while she was being fitted out for military use, disaster struck.
Fire, sparked by an acetylene torch, swept through the proud ship. Thousands of workmen fled for their lives, as firemen from all parts of New York and neighboring cities fought the fire around the clock.
Normandie's designer, Vladimir Yorkovich, was in New York at the time. He knew how to save his creation.
Yorkovich went to Admiral Andrews and said, I know this ship inside and out. I can do it blindfolded. You can blindfold me if you want to, but I'll open the sea cocks. She will sink 4 feet and be perfectly safe. Andrew said, "This is a Navy job. Get out."
As the New York Fire Department poured more water onto the fire, Normandie became top-heavy. Within hours, she capsized and sank. After the war, survivors like the Queens returned to elegant ocean-going, but the days of greatness were numbered. A brilliant era was drawing to a close. But not before America made one more try to link the continents by sea and to burnish the golden age of ocean travel. After World War II, the United States was triumphant, the most powerful nation on Earth. There was only one area the US could not claim as its own, the commercial sea lanes. The US never had an ocean liner to rival the French or the British or the Germans, but that was about to change. In 1950, the United States Lines Company persuaded Congress to help fund a revolutionary ship that would prove America could dominate the waves as well as she dominated the world. They would call her the United States.
We laid her keel. American know-how began building the greatest ship in the world. For it was the special skills of many men, the technical knowledge of many master craftsmen known as America's industrial might, that helped the United States to write headlines.
Her designer was a true American original, William Francis Gibbs. He'd trained as a lawyer, but never let go of his childhood enthusiasm for the sea and for ships. Ships eventually won out over the law.
After he realized that he was not turned out to be a lawyer, he returned to what he really loved, designing ships in his own attic, in his own home in Philadelphia.
Gibbs was driven by passion and perhaps patriotism.
He wanted the Americans to have the world's fastest liner as an ultimate symbol of power, prestige, nationalism.
He had this animosity with England, and he was so terribly conscious of their strength. He was just determined to outdo them.
But he had nothing but respect for the French and their extraordinary ship, Normandie.
One of the earliest and most eager visitors come on board was Gibbs, who with his secretary, who took shorthand on the run, followed his master around all over the ship, and Gibbs even ducked down where he could into crew staircases and went down to snoop in the engine room. He was very anxious to see how the Normandie made her speed.
Speed, that elusive element that taunted every shipbuilder daring to take on the Atlantic. Speed would be essential if the United States were to win the Blue Riband. Like others before him, Gibbs turned to the latest technology. In this case, the strongest and lightest substances available, like aluminum.
Even the deck rails are made of highly polished, lightweight aluminum, and they remain cool as a cucumber with the hottest sun shining on them.
There was another reason for so much aluminum. Gibbs was haunted by the way the Normandie met her end. He was determined the United States would not meet the same fate.
He had a tremendous phobia for fire, for safety, but for fire in particular. Anything that was flammable, he had the bedspreads treated, even the drapes, they were all fire resistant.
He ordained there'd be no wood on board the United States except for the chopping blocks and the pianos. And he even wanted Louis Steinway to build him an aluminum piano. And Steinway said, "No, I won't."
He saw a crewman in one of the cabins with a wood-framed photograph of his family. He snatched up the photograph because no wood was permitted on board the ship and returned it the next day with an aluminum frame.
As well as fire-resistant, the craft was also light, of course, and able to reach phenomenal speeds thanks to her powerful engines.
She had in her engine room this remarkable set of high-pressure turbines that were just phenomenal. They've never been equaled.
In fact, the speeds the United States achieved during sea trials remained a closely guarded secret, one of many the eccentric Gibbs kept from the outside world.
When the full hull model was brought up to the United States Lines office in New York, Gibbs had the bottom half of it encased in plywood so that nobody could see the configuration of the underwater hull. They didn't want that secret known. She, of course, took the cream of the traffic. By 1952, the Queens were not old hat, but they were yesterday's ship as opposed to today's ship.
The United States was the pride of the American Merchant Marine. She was our ship, and she was the fastest ship.
She touches a chord in every American heart.
She achieved what her creators wanted. She won the Blue Riband on her 1952 maiden voyage, clipping 12 hours off the Queen Mary's best time. The United States became the last ocean liner to win that symbolic prize, and for a brief time she even flew a blue banner meant to evoke her triumph. In an earlier day, it might have been the first of many triumphs, but no more. As air travel became more popular and affordable, transatlantic sea crossing seemed old-fashioned and slow. By the mid-1950s, the tide had begun to turn.
That awful year of 1956, and I say awful year because that was the year, the crossover year, when more people flew than took ships. And it was a gap that started there, the thin end of an awful wedge that began with the ascendancy of the aircraft and the ultimate disaster for the ocean liners.
When the first jet flew from New York to London and then London back to New York, and instead of 6 days, it became 6 hours. The next morning, Cunard Line in Liverpool announced that flying is just a fad. People will always want to travel by the Queen Mary, for example. Well, then 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of the business, and by 1965, they had 95% of the business. All of a sudden, one day, you sort of looked around, and the piers were empty. And those great steamship offices in Lower Manhattan were gone. So it was like seeing, a good friend gone. It was sad, really. Very sad.
In 1969, the United States was taken out of commission. She ended up moored in her maker's hometown, slowly decaying.
She's sitting there in Philadelphia, and some Philadelphia newspaper had the nerve to call her an old tub. What's she doing in our beautiful waterfront? Why can't we get rid of her? That would have killed Gibbs. Simply killed him.
By that time, the ocean liner industry itself was nearly killed too. In the 1960s, Britain's Cunard Line tried to keep the business alive with a second Queen Elizabeth, the QE2. But even she couldn't revive the glory days. Year-round crossings became a thing of the past. The QE2 was diverted elsewhere, to warmer waters, often sailing around the Caribbean. It turned out she would have plenty of company. Once, great ships plied the Atlantic, steaming from continent to continent. A voyage was an adventure, a race against time and tides. Fortunes were made and lives were lost in the pursuit of speed, or luxury, or that legendary prize, the Blue Riband. It was a pursuit worthy of great nations and great dreamers. Today, sea travel is something far different. Transatlantic crossing has given way to Caribbean and other forms of cruising.
Cruises are not the same as crossings. In other words, when a ship was going from New York to Southampton at speed, there was a certain purpose about where you were going. And the entire ship, everybody in it was all going from one continent to another. When you go on a cruise, you're essentially going on shipboard for the fun of it. Most of the people who are boarding ships today are there because of the romance of the old days, but they're not getting the voyage of the old days.
But while the voyage may be very different now, there are some aspects of the old days that do still live on.
You're on deck and there's a billion stars overhead, because the air is so wonderfully clear at sea. The gentle roll of the ship, the stroll on the promenade deck, it all conjures up images that we've either read about or seen in the movies. it's kind of another world. You're taken out of this world.
You still dine as you did in the old ships at a certain hour, and you have the same waiter. You still dress for dinner. The major event of the day is dinner, and I think that never changes.
Oh, I like it. I like dressing up, and it's a nice affair.
I like to dress up and be dressed up with my wife. That adds to the romanticism of the thing, I think.
Seeing everyone else in gowns and everything, it was pretty neat.
Perhaps the attire is not quite the same of full evening gown and jewels and tuxedos and that kind of white tails maybe, but that tone is still there.
The tone lingers and echoes of a glorious past. Somewhere in memory, a lounge awaits, a carved banister to hold, a wooden deck to walk. A whistle sounds and an anchor is raised, and a voyage begins to someplace across the horizon, London perhaps, or Paris, or Rome. For a brief time, there are no wars or breadlines. There is only the sea and the promise of a welcoming port. Bon voyage.